Hello there, welcome to My First Time, where we find out the gaming history of some of gaming's favourite people. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast app of your choice, make sure to leave us some love in the comments, in the reviews, or, however you need to leave us some love. On today's episode, we have the mastermind behind Formula One games / the game director of Formula One games. I'm sure you would be called the mastermind if you had the chance, but Lee Mathers from Codemasters. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Yeah, really pleased to be here.
And big question, I suppose, to get this show on the road or on the track, just because it's not every time you get to make a Formula One pun. What was your first time?
Yeah, it's. I was thinking about this on the way up on the train, and sort of very early memories for me. Probably junior school. There was a kid in my class, we were good friends, and his dad had got an Atari at home, but it wasn't a console, it was a more sort of PC version of one of the Ataris at the time, a home computer. And he bought it with the intention that obviously his son would use it for work-related things, school-related things, and he was an intelligent guy, his dad, but also he did play games. So you could play the sort of stuff that you could play on an Atari 600 on it, 2600. So I remember a game that we used to play on that called Fort Apocalypse. And I think it was, I'm sure it was either a side-scrolling or sort of a semi-3D looking shooter of some description. But that's sort of a very vague memory. But I think it really sort of kicks in when my uncle bought a ColecoVision. So, being able to play things like an almost arcade-perfect Donkey Kong on that was absolutely outstanding. And then my next door neighbour had a Spectrum, so we'd play things like School Days and Transformers. And that's really when it sort of cemented, my love of gaming.
Can you remember the first console you were bought yourself or you bought yourself?
Yeah, so my parents bought us a ColecoVision because we kept trying to borrow my uncle's. So we had that. And even though it's sort of now completely defunct, the brand's been gone for a long time. At the time, it was better than pretty much everything else that was out there. The quality of the games were incredible. They had a license with Nintendo, so there was Nintendo stuff on there. They had things like the Cabbage Patch Kids game on there. They had, Zaxxon and Gorf and even a racing game called Turbo, which came with a steering wheel and pedal, which was amazing. And my uncle went and bought that, and I was always trying to borrow it from him.
So obviously, F1 being a racing game from a young age, I suppose you were quite addicted to racing games, I imagine. Yeah,
I mean, my mum always tells people the story that I've been obsessed with cars since I was a child. I would run up to people in car parks and just tell them what car my granddad had got and things like that. So I've always collected cars. I've always wanted to play car games. I've always wanted to drive cars, see cars. I always used to go to the motor show when I was a kid, things like that. So racing games have always been a passion for me. And I've always played pretty much all of them, the good, the bad, the ugly, the ones that we make, the ones that the people make. I just play them all generally.
Yeah. Did your granddad ever get an exciting car? Like, was it worth shouting about?
He really didn't. He really didn't. His Peugeot estate was really not that exciting.
So obviously, I mean, it might not be a racing game, but obviously you've talked about your first games. But what about your favourite game? Can you remember the first time you played that?
Yeah. There's a standout game for me, and it's easy. Sometimes it's really hard to come up with what your favourite of anything is. In gaming, I've got a fairly rigid top 10 that will always sort of stick with me, and it's probably some of them I'll never play again because I never want to soil the memory because maybe of the time they were perfect and now they wouldn't hold up so well. But Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was the one that really did it for me. It was just perfect. There was nothing I didn't enjoy in that game. And I think I'd probably still enjoy it now. But I don't ever want to go back and spoil that memory just in case.
So you've only ever played the N64 version of it?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I know people said when the 3DS version came out, it was a solid sort of port.
I'm sure it was, but I think part of the N64 experience was also sort of the amount of games on the N64 at the time that I played was fairly limited. I mean, looking in the loft now, I think I've probably got about 20 games I bought for the N64. So there was Diddy Kong Racing. That was awesome. But it was also the controller, I think, was also what made the experience so special. And I always felt that if I ever played it on another platform, it wouldn't work because the controller was pretty much designed hand in hand with Mario and Zelda in mind, wasn't it? So,
which is why it was always awkward on some games because just like I always go back to I always bring up this argument with GoldenEye, and it's a perfect example of you saying games that when you go back to, you're like, oh no, why have I done this? And it's just like it's not designed for a first-person shooter, the N64, really. And there's easy to have fond memories of it, but it just gets a very muddied way of doing it.
Yeah, so GoldenEye is another one that sits in my top 10, and
Yeah.
again, like to date, probably wouldn't hold up very well. And I have gone back and played GoldenEye since, and it just doesn't feel right. But
Yeah.
again, it only felt right on that controller because it was kind of the way they crafted the whole game was to work on that style of controller.
Yeah.
So it did work well. The aiming and stuff worked well, but on anything else, it didn't feel right.
Yeah. And what about racing games then? What would you say? Obviously, let's not ignore Formula One, but I imagine the Formula One games you work on are your favourite racing games. But outside of the Formula One games, what are your favourite racing games?
So I think over time, probably, I mean, when I had an Amiga, that was probably my real sort of foray into big gaming when I played a lot. So things like Supercars by Gremlin, they were just amazing top-down races, awesome fun, really good. Ivan Iron Man Stewart's off-road racing, there was a conversion of that to Amiga that was good fun. I played the Lotus Turbo Challenge games to death. And then obviously the biggest one was Jeff Crammond's Grand Prix on the Amiga for me. So even before I was even considering this sort of angle as a job, I played Jeff Crammond's Grand Prix on the Amiga full season, 100% distance, to the point where the Competition Pro 5000 joystick I had, one of the micro switches broke because I'd just been holding it forward, accelerating for so long. So I actually swapped the micro switch out because I was so familiar with that. It was the joystick that I was so used to using. So I think that was probably one of the biggest. And then sort of in more recent years, when Gran Turismo came along, that just blew me away. I mean, I remember I was actually in the industry when the transition from SNES onto sort of PlayStation came about. So, we were playing Mario Kart to death in the office, and then we had an import PlayStation bought over by somebody who we worked with, and I was blown away by Ridge Racer. It was just like, this is arcade quality in the home. I've since seen the two side by side and played the two side by side, and you realise it isn't. But at the time, it was mind blowing. So Gran Turismo, the original Gran Turismo, was just it was a genre defining game, I think, for me.
Yeah, and I think like most would agree that that's still one of the most iconic 3D races. So it helped sort of set the foundation.
Without doubt. And also around the same time, there was Project Gotham Racing, and obviously before that, Metropolis Street Racer, which was incredible. I had that on the Dreamcast. Being a car geek as I am, at the time I was just so happy that I could purchase the car in game that I owned at the time and put my number plate on it and drive it around the streets in the game. And I still do that now. I still do that in all the games I play now. If I can have the car that I own or the cars that I want to own, then that's what I do.
Have you ever put your granddad's Peugeot estate into a game?
Do you know, I'm pretty sure it would work well in Grid. It would be it'd be good for the Destruction Derby. I'm pretty sure it was robust.
Yeah. And obviously you've been around the games industry for a while, working on various bits and pieces. So what was the first game you worked on? Can you remember that?
Yeah, so I've done different roles in the games industry. And so in terms of actually working more directly on a game, I was QA in my first job at Elite Systems. So Elite did games like Striker, the football game, for Rage. We did conversions like Joe Mack. And back in the day, Elite were famous for doing Paperboy, Space Harrier, conversions like that were big name conversions on home computers. So I sort of dipped into the QA side of it first. So I was QAing games like Striker, like Joe Mack, like Dr. Frankie, Joe and Dirk on the Tiles, little puzzle game on Game Boy. So it was sort of NES, SNES, Game Boy stuff, some Amiga stuff at that period. So I think the first thing I actually directly impacted on was one of the football games we were working on, where I actually started doing the stats for the players. So I'm not a big football guy, but I did a lot of research. I bought a lot of books and magazines, and I started putting together the teams and the team stats for one of the Striker titles that we were working on.
So I imagine obviously this day and age, FIFA cards and like footballers themselves get up in arms if they're not given the ranking they want. So I
would
suppose
imagine so.
You would have been the person that would have annoyed a lot of footballers, I imagine.
But back then, the visibility of it was very different, wasn't it? These days, it's front and centre. They're very aware of what people are doing with their names and their licenses, and that's their brand, isn't it? So back then, I guess it was maybe not quite so focused on.
Yeah, I suppose most footballers back then, I suppose, were more interested in having a pint and having a pie, sort of thing.
Possibly, it's possible.
And obviously, you say you've worked in the QA side of things. What other sort of jobs have you had through the
so
years?
When I moved to Rage, we were still obviously doing things like Striker. We were doing a puzzle game called Trash It. We did sort of a speedball style game called Deadball Zone. And all throughout that period, I was crossing over into different things. So I was kind of the go-to guy for so many different things in the office. So it'd be sort of, if somebody needed DVDs burning, that's what I was doing. If somebody needed a little bit of production assistance, I would help with that. At some points, I even delved into doing a little bit of art. You know, sometimes you get some assets from one platform that needed tweaking for another one. I remember making some really strange changes to a scoreboard in Striker on the Saturn, you know, because we'd already done the PlayStation version, we were converting to Saturn. You know, so I delved into that a little bit as well. So it was quite wide-reaching, and Trash It was a side-scrolling puzzle game where you were a guy with a big hammer and you were smashing up levels to get through the level. And you know, and I helped a little bit with the level design on that. So I was always trying to stay as close to the game side of it as possible, even though that wasn't, you know, directly my remit at the time.
I had no idea you worked on Dead Bullseye, and I absolutely loved Dead Bullseye as a kid.
Yeah, it was a surprisingly good game, that was.
It was like, it's basically soccer, isn't it, mixed with like American football and just shooting each other, I guess.
Yeah. So I think the inspiration for it was obviously the Bitmap Brothers Speedball games, Speedball 1 and 2. Speedball 2, I think somebody of my age, is one of those games that, again, is probably maybe just outside my top 10, but it was something awesome.
And out of all of these games that you've worked on like over the years, and you know, a variety of roles, because I know obviously you worked on 50 Cent Blood in the Sand, but like, what would you say is the weirdest game you've probably worked on?
I think so. 50 Cent, my involvement in that one was really, I was in IT at the time, so my involvement on that was really as a QA guy. So I played it quite a lot when I had a bit of downtime between what I was doing. So obviously we all worked in the same office. We all talked about what was going on in the game, the balancing of the game, the pacing of the game. In fact, one of the guys who headed that up is now also working on Formula One, funnily enough. He's now heading up part of the Formula One design team. So I think 50 Cent is probably that weirdest game because, as I think my boss always says, there's nothing stranger than a bunch of brummies suddenly working on a 50 Cent game. It's not what you expect, is it? We're not gangster. You know, we're not down with 50. I mean, obviously a lot of us enjoyed his music, but it was like it was weird. People writing the script as well, you know, obviously that was a strange one for people to have to go.
That is the Crystal Skull one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where, so if you aren't aware of the plot, it's basically he goes to do a gig and is promised a crystal skull, and then it gets stolen, and they go on a shooting rampage through like the Middle East to try and get it. Yeah. The story's insane, but the game's insane as well. And it's one of those games that the first one was a huge success based purely off his name, and the second one, because the first one hadn't been such a great title, the second one didn't do so well because people were expecting it not to be a great game. But it is actually a really fun game. It's a really good jaunt. It looked good. It sounded good. It had a really humorous story. I mean, you couldn't take it seriously. But the star of the show was the swear button. Somebody said, let's put a swear button in and just randomly be able to swear as you go through the levels. It's like, it never grows old. I think that's the thing. I think like, and that's why it's become such a weird cult following, which is why I felt I had to ask you about it, because it's just like, here's someone who's worked on all these racing games, but also 50 Cent Blood in the Sand, which, as I didn't realise it was made by a bunch of brummies, so that makes it even more interesting.
It was when we were Swordfish Studios, I believe we were doing that one. We were part of Vivendi at the time, and we did that. I mean, there's been a few games that the studio as a whole really has put out that weren't even racing titles, because we hadn't done racing seriously for years. We did a few racing titles at Rage. I worked on a few racing titles at Elite. And we did an SFX game called Dirt Racer, which I worked on. I helped train the AI on that one. I mean, that was back on the SNES, and it was terrible because 3D back then was just a real struggle. But it was an SFX chip-powered game. But we, as a studio, we'd also done a game called Hostile Waters, which was sort of a carrier command style game in 3D where you had a carrier that you resurrected, and it was based on that sort of a war game, and that was really incredible as well. And then there was also Cold Winter, which was sort of a Cold War first-person shooter, which was an awesome game. But again, it just didn't really get the sales that it needed, but it was critically really well received, and that seemed to have been the theme with those sort of three games. Everybody loved them, they just didn't really get the traction that they deserved.
And unfortunately, I suppose that's the sad way of the games industry sometimes.
It can be,
but obviously the games you've worked on, the things you've worked on have done well enough for you to be at Codemasters and in the role that you are now with Formula One. But how did you originally fall into the Formula One games? Yeah,
there's a bit of a long-winded story to it, but to cut it short, we were acquired as a studio by Codemasters to make the Formula One game. They needed a team to make Formula One. The Codemasters, the studio that I was in Birmingham became available, so they purchased the studio. As soon as I knew what was happening, I just had to facilitate a move into working on either Formula One or Grid or Dirt. You know, it was something that I couldn't have coped with. I would have just had to leave because I couldn't be in a studio creating racing games and not be integrally involved.
The one guy just sat there just like twiddling his thumbs, not doing racing games.
It would have killed me. It would have just destroyed my soul. I couldn't have coped. And at the time, Gavin Rayburn and Ralph Fulton were heading up the development teams there. So obviously now Gav and Ralph have gone on to start Playground.
Yeah.
So I started talking to Gav whenever I could, sort of just get a conversation going, try and sort of make him aware of who I was, what I did, sort of more just sort of friendly than anything else. And then we got to the point where he said, right, he says, have a sit down with Ralph, because Ralph was heading up design. And he said, see if Ralph takes you and see how that goes. And then literally within weeks of that discussion, the two of them both left and started Playground. So I went back to my corner and I was like, damn it, what am I going to do now? That's tricky. It's like, I'm just going to have to mope around for a bit, take stock of the situation and see where I can go. And then sat at my desk, an email drops in one day from Steve Hood, who was my boss at the time. He joined Codemasters and started to head up the Formula One design team. Yeah. And I just had a random email from him that just said, somebody dropped your name in conversation as somebody I should speak to about coming and working on the F1 design team. He said, have you got a CV you can send me?
Oh, nice.
I said, I do. It's not relevant in any way, shape or form to what you're asking, but I've got one. And he said, let's meet in the boardroom in 10 minutes. So I just sat down in the boardroom with Steve and Paul Geel, and we had a chat for half an hour. Yeah. And I joined the design team. And that was 2008, I would say. And obviously I've worked on every F1 game since.
Yeah. So a classic case of if you don't ask, you don't get sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to get my face in there, trying to, facilitate the move. You can't force these things. They either work or they don't. But I think sort of the perseverance of always staying in games, always staying close to games, always been part of the games industry, whether it was directly impacted on the title or the wider sort of studio sort of remit, was always. I never wanted to leave the games industry ever. It's like once you're in, it's really hard to do anything else. I think is where you kind of become institutionalized.
Yeah, and I suppose most people that work in it, like yourself, are just so passionate about the industry that they don't want to leave and do something else.
Yeah, definitely. I think these days I always worry about using the word passion because it's sort of been repurposed by people into, if somebody in a position of power says passion, people think, oh, you're just going to run your staff into the ground. And it's like, it isn't the case. It's like, I would never want to put people through some of the things that I've been through in development because it is physically, mentally destroying, but some people, you can't cope with that sort of thing. And like I used to do some crazy hours. We used to do that back in the day on PlayStation, the early PlayStation days, the hours that you would put in. Yeah. But that's what you did, and it's like you learn from that, and now you hopefully never have to put other people through that because you've learned from it.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, what was the longest shift you think you did back on the PlayStation?
Oh, days? You do a couple of days in the studio, people sleeping on settees or stopping in hotels.
Yeah, but I suppose, as you said, like the word passion, I suppose, has got repurposed a bit. Like maybe a poor choice of words myself there, but it is a case of I think it's made a lot of developers, and as you seem to be saying yourself, like realise. We don't want these people to crunch, so let's just try and stop this sort of mentality where we can.
Yeah, we learned a lot from it, but I also look back really fondly on all of it, apart from the day that I wrote a car off because I was a bit tired, but we'll brush over that. But I remember ridiculous things like, I think we were working on Striker 96, something like that. Yeah. And we were all working late on a Friday night. We'd got Radio 1 on in the office, and it was whatever the dance show was on Radio 1 that evening. And we even called up and requested a track, and we got them to play The Prodigy for us. And we were in the office at sort of midnight with that track on, with a dedication to us working in the office, And it's like, in some ways, it really brings a team together. Yeah. It's a really sort of strong feeling of camaraderie, and that's one of the things that the games industry still has, in buckets, really. There's a lot of people with a very passionate sort of outlook on it and shared goals, basically.
Yeah, and it's lovely to still see that like there is just this big camaraderie, I suppose, still in the industry, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's a slightly generic question, but if anyone is looking to obviously get into the industry, what is the main bit of advice sort of you'd give them? Because it seems half your story is just saying to people, I want to do this, and I'm convincing them that that's the right thing. Yeah,
I think because of the different things I've done over the years, I had a really good view of different areas of the industry, and that's been very helpful for me. You sort of understand the timings of things. If you see a little bit of production, and it also makes you a lot more easygoing with other people. It makes you a lot more open to what they have to say, and also the struggles they go through in other departments. Yeah. It's very easy in my position to sit there and say, I want that. Yeah. And it's like without any consideration for what other departments have to go through. So I think having seen that makes it a much better sort of relationship I have with everybody else in the studio. So my route in was through QA, and it's still a very valid route into the games industry, depending what you want to do. But something that didn't used to exist was all of the university and college courses that exist now. There's very formal ones for sort of game design, and even eSports. Now there's courses in eSports, which I assume are very much a business style sort of course. There's obviously routes that you could always take as a programmer or as an artist. You can't just come up and be an artist if you don't have any art skills. I can't draw, so I could never do anything in that area. But there's so many different ways of getting into the industry. I always say, focus on what it is that you want to actually do, because sometimes people come in with just sort of a scatter shot. Oh, I want to work in games. And it's like, what was it you'd like to do? And so you can give them some ideas of what they want to do. And until sometimes people don't understand what the roles actually entail. A title is very misleading a lot of the time. So, but as long as you've got to do a little bit of research, understand what the roles are, understand if it's something you're actually excited about doing, something you want to do, and then start looking at, where you can get a foothold in it, basically. And
obviously you mentioned, just because you mentioned eSport there, the F1 eSports scene is obviously something that's got fantastic drivers and, some genuinely impressive racing going on there. Do you think, what do you think is the future for that? Is it a good platform, and do you think it could help even elevate Formula One, the sport, as well?
Well, it definitely helped Formula One. You look at someone like myself who's been a Formula One fan for a very long time. I'm not the youngest guy in the world anymore, but gaming traditionally has a younger demographic than a sport like Formula One. We really certainly helped to bridge that gap. You only have to look at the social channels and you'll see people who initially, when we started the eSports, who were very traditional Formula One fans, it's like, this is gaming, no interest for me. Now, it's being defended in there by people. You've got people saying, actually, have you watched it? Watch it. It's incredible. The racing's fantastic. Don't just dismiss it because it's a virtual version of the sport. It's actually incredible racing. It's really exciting to watch. And the thing that's probably really sort of strikes a chord now is that we've seen it, how it's changed people's lives. It's seen like how obviously Brendan, who was our champion 2 years in a row, how his entire life's changed, but also how his health's changed, how his mental health's changed, how he's become such a strong character. He's trained hard with the guys, he's lost a lot of weight, he's really, changed his life significantly for what people might say, it's just a game. It's like, well, it isn't, is it? He's now got a full career based around it. He actually works for Mercedes Formula One. And we've seen other drivers picked up by the teams. This year we've got all of the official Formula One teams taking part. That shows how seriously people are taking it. The prize fund's bigger this year. There's more events this year. Obviously we've already kicked off the qualifying for the season next year. And next week I'm down in London for the next round of live shows. So it's growing big.
And obviously I was out with you for the Austrian F1 where I got to try and play against an actual F1 driver, and even they were getting really competitive at this game, and it's just like, I must win, I must do this sort of thing. And most of my time was, I must try not to crash into the barrier, which just seemed to happen a lot when I was trying to race about.
It's always the case. Every time you put a Formula One driver in the seat, they can't help but be competitive. I was talking to I got a taxi to the station earlier, and the taxi driver just asked what I did. And I told him, and he's like, he says, I love playing Formula One. I was like, okay, that's convenient. So we were talking about Formula One and racing games. And I was saying, like, back in 2010, because he said, have you ever met Lewis Hamilton? I said, yeah, I've met Lewis a couple of times. He said, what's he like? I said, well, the first time I met Lewis was Spa 2010. And we were filming with the BBC. And it was Lewis versus Jake versus his brother Nick in the UK on Formula One 2010. And we set up in the McLaren hospitality, and we got it all up and running. And all day it was a nightmare. We couldn't get a connection because of the NAT on the internet connection. Eventually we got it up and running. Lewis sits down next to me and he's like, right, what's this all about? Does a few laps. He's like, yeah, it's fun, enjoying myself. And he said, so you know that you're racing against your brother Nick, you're racing against Jake Humphrey. He's like, yeah, I'll beat Jake. He said, how's Nick doing? I said, well, Nick at the time was still a very strong virtual sort of racer. He hadn't moved into real motorsport. And Lewis says, what sort of lap time's Nick doing? I told him. He's like, right, that's it. How do I beat him? And that was it. The gloves were off. And he sat down and he changed. He was like, right, I'm going to pay attention. I'm going to beat him. I'm not having that. And and all of a sudden that was it. The competitive animal came out straight away. And it's that was always, and it's the same with all the drivers. As soon as they get in the seat, they're sort of, this is really good. And you see them start to just naturally be quick. And then you sort of, well, what sort of time did so-and-so do? And you tell them, and they're like, right, I've got to beat it. And you were there. We couldn't get Pierre out of the seat, could we? His PR guy was fuming. He's like, come on, Pierre, you've got other things to do. And he's like, just one more lap.
Obviously the racer was Pierre Gasly, and it was just a case of he just wouldn't stop. I remember he did all right on the actual race day, and then he smashed it the week after. But it's just funny watching this person who must have the simulation games to play all the time anyway. And it was still like, no, I want to play this. And And have you seen that over the years, like a sort of respect built around for what you do and the games you make?
Oh, without doubt. Yeah, without doubt. I mean, Formula One's a huge industry, and obviously all the people involved, I always say they're very similar to the way we work. They're very similar, but obviously for outsiders coming in, they're kind of quite cautious. It's like, what do you want? What are you trying to get from us? What's in it for you? But then as soon as we've started building the relationships over the years with them, they're like, can we get the game now? Can we come and have a look around the studio? Can we get involved?
Yeah.
And everybody wants to work together. And I always say, like, that first sort of meeting that I had with the guys at McLaren, their PR guy at the time, just talking to him, it's like we all work the same way. You know, they all go the extra mile. I mean, you look at the time and effort they put in Formula One, you know, and a lot of it isn't just because it's a job. It's because they are absolutely, you know, in love with the sport and in love with what they do. And it's like we work very similar in the way that, you know, games are developed, Formula One cars are developed. Yeah. But the love and the passion behind it is really what drives, you know, both industries, I think.
And obviously, like you said, Formula 1 08 would have been the first one you worked on. Can you remember what you did on that game?
Yeah, so F1 2010, I did the handling, vehicle handling. I also designed a couple of the features. I don't remember which ones, but I remember being in the handling and developing the physics with the coders on that one for months. And I carried on doing the handling and the achievements and some of the other bits and pieces until probably 2000 and I think 12 was probably the last one I did handling on. Yeah. Maybe 11.
And I suppose that's why you say, like, now that you're in the role of being the creative director of the whole game, you have an appreciation that when it goes down the ranks, this is going to take time. You have an understanding of that, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's probably one of the biggest benefits I've had. I mean, sometimes if you've worked on a game for a very long time, it becomes hard to still be motivated and still interested in doing it. Yeah. But I still see every year where we can make improvements, things we can do to make the game better, to, you know, broaden the audience, to, you know, really you know, push it on year. And also, I think that sort of the teams see that as well, and you know, they want to do the same thing. So, but definitely having worked in different areas, you do have a better understanding. I say it's very easy in my position to just say, do that, I want that, and not have any consideration for what's involved in achieving it. Yeah. So I think that's why myself and Ian, who's the exec producer on the title, we work really well together, because it's a short development cycle. If you spend all your time just fighting amongst yourselves about trying to what you can and what you can't do, you're not doing anything. Yeah. So, you know, we're very good at coming to a very quick solution to any of the problems and always, you know, making sure it's for the best.
Yeah, and I imagine it's much more fun to try and fight between the other Codemaster car making or car racing game people. Like, do you have a little bit of competition between like Grid and Dirt and all the rest?
There's natural competition. I mean, I love all of our games. I love racing games. Yeah. So, like I said, you know, before I was part of Codemasters, I played the original Grid, and it was Dirt 2 at the time, I think. I got burgled, and they both got stolen. And I went out and bought them for a second time because I liked those games so much. And it's not changed now. You know, I'm really looking forward to Grid. As I said to you on the way up on the train, I was playing Grid on the Switch. So I always want to come out and beat them. I mean, honestly, to be honest, yes, of course you want to beat them. But it benefits everybody when they do well, and they're in different areas of motorsport. So there's we always say what we want is for everybody to literally just buy all Codemasters racing games. It should be if you like racing games, it should be a no-brainer. You know, a new Grid comes out, you've got to have it. It's a Codemasters racing game. Dirt comes out, Codemasters racing game. You can't miss that. Formula One, same thing. So that's what we're really aiming for, is that people just immediately associate Codemasters with the best racing games out there.
Yeah, and obviously Formula One games has built up this massive community of loyal fans over the years. Do you find interacting with the community as like a good way to come up with new ideas to put in, or of like what to put in next year's games?
Yeah, there's obviously got to be a degree of, we know what we're doing from the start, and this is the game we're going to make. But you can certainly take on a lot of influence from the community. The community we've got is enormous now, and it's also one of the most educated communities in gaming, I would say, because they're Formula One fans as well, so they understand the sport and they expect the sport in the game. Yeah. And then we've obviously got the more casual side of gaming, who want to play a game that represents Formula One, but they're not so interested in the Formula One side of it. They just like the fact that it's a really good racing game, and it's got some great, you know, loops in the career, some great hooks that keep you wanting to play through. You know, I think we've got a very unique career experience, which isn't something many racing games have. So I think for people who aren't even Formula One fans, that's the sort of thing that brings them in. I mean, for years, We courted the community quite heavily and brought them into the studio on a regular basis to get feedback while we were in development, and that's something we've continued to do. A little bit less in the last couple of years because obviously the development has now matured quite heavily. You know, we've got a very sort of a very solid game. There's a lot of game there.
Yeah.
But we still have somebody in the office who actually goes through all of our social channels and collates all of the feedback, and all of that gets fed back to the design team. And we always have to sort of react to that and comment on what we've seen. So obviously that gets fed back to us. I'll go through it and say, actually, it's a really good idea. We'll discuss it amongst ourselves and see if it's something we can act on. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot that we take from the community these days, and we've seen that side grow as well. I mean, originally you look at sort of like Tim McMurdoch and Arava, and then you look at Matty G now, whether he's presenting the eSports. Yeah. You know, those are guys who they started their channels out with F1 2010, some of them, and now the size of the channels and the influence and the reach they have, you know, is great that they've worked so hard to build those channels. But you know, F1's helped them to do that, and in the same way they've helped us to build F1.
Yeah, and obviously with talking about the future of the games, which I know you can probably only give me very, very vague answers. But in terms of classic cars from Formula One, is there any that you haven't been able to put in a game that you would love to put in a game?
Yeah, I mean, there's for me personally, because I'm a Formula One fan, there's a lot of cars in the past that I would love to have seen in the game. Some of them are just logistically impossible. Yeah. I mean, the number of times somebody's gone, let's put the 6-wheel Tyrrell in there, and then somebody goes, well, how the hell are we going to do the pit stops? You know, we're going to have to suddenly get 2 pit guys to take 2 front wheels off a car. You know, so it's like logistically, technically, that one's. I always get slapped down on that one. We joked about the Brabham fan car at one point, you know, with the fan that sucked it down onto the track. And then there's cars that are sort of, the really obscure ones that people don't remember. You know, people talk about like the 40 course or things like that, just teams that were very short-lived and came and went very quickly. Yeah. And then there's those that, you know, they were prominent teams in their day, but they're no longer around. It's like, well, it's very hard to understand who you go to actually get the license for that car. Yeah. So, there's certainly been some obscure and interesting ones over the years, and you forget that, you know, a few years ago Formula One did have a ridiculous number of teams. There were so many little teams in there, and some of them just came and went within a season.
And obviously, speaking of teams, what team do you support and what races do you support?
Yeah, so I've always been, it's a tricky one these days. I'm finding it harder because I've always been a Renault fan. So I love Renault. I've always loved their road cars. So I've always followed the sort of Formula One team as well. Yeah. And, you know, I used to go to Silverstone with Renault back when Alonso was there, and I've still got, you know, the goodie bags they would give out when they used to try and turn the grandstand blue. So I've still got the old Renault T-shirts from those years with the Mild 7 sponsorship, and you know, back when I say Alonso was in the car, so sort of 2005, 6, around that sort of period. Yeah. So Renault's always been one that I've always loved, probably because of Nigel Mansell, you know, fellow Brummie. Yeah. You know, back in the 90s.
Great moustache.
Exactly, and the guy was just a legend. You know, he was kind of like the Colin McRae of Formula One, wasn't he? You know, they were both at a similar sort of just get out there and give it everything. Yeah. So Renault's always been a big one. These days, I always said that I would never follow sort of the likes of. I'm not big into Mercedes, but Lewis drew me to Mercedes instantly. Yeah. So I think I've realised that Renault I'll always have a soft spot for, but I blatantly follow the driver. Yeah. And obviously Lewis is what, you know, draws me to Mercedes.
I mean, and he's a great driver. It's why he is considered one of the world's best, because he's very good at what he does and has been for years now.
Yeah. I mean, I always remember I was at Silverstone for Lewis's last year in GP2 as it was at the time, and I can't remember the setup for the race, but he certainly wasn't anywhere near the front, and lap after lap he came past and he passed more and more cars, and we were in, I think it was Luffield C, and he would come out from under the tunnel and he'd be putting an overtake on somebody, and every lap he was either passing or he'd passed more cars. And I just remember at the end of the race he got a standing ovation, like the whole grandstand was just cheering and clapping. It's like, that guy's going to go like really far. You know, he was electric. He wasn't just like overtaking like anybody else was. It was just, everything was just so perfect. It was solid. He was just absolutely going for it. And so I think that cemented, you know, why I've always followed Lewis.
Yeah. And I suppose in terms of like talking about the future as well, and I'll try and keep this more about next gen. So in terms of like, what would you like to be doing in terms of features on next gen that you haven't really been able to do much this gen?
You know, there's not really a great deal I can say without giving anything away. I think we've had a plan. We've got a plan. We know where it's going. Yeah. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything else just because I could get a slap wrist.
That's fine. We'll leave your wrists unslapped. So an easier question I hope you can answer. But when you are playing the game, what is your go-to car?
So this year I actually started my career season in the Sauber for a change. That was a bit different for me because I've traditionally sort of started with the Renault. Last year I think I started with the Toro Rosso. This year I went Sauber. I thought something different. I thought they would stand a good chance. I thought it would be a sort of not too far to the back of the pack. Also, great looking livery, great looking car, which is obviously an important consideration when you're picking your team as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's So this year I'm driving the Sauber, but I've always gravitate to the Renault when I can.
And obviously with F1 being such a renowned license sort of thing, do you ever wish you had more freedom that you don't get with license work, or do you love it?
I think there's grown to be a misconception around how tightly constrained you are when you have a license. I think it probably depends very much on the title. It also depends on your relationship with the licensor. I mean, we've now worked with Formula One for a very long period of time. Yeah. So they understand how we work, we understand how they work, and we get the best out of each other, I think. I can't really think of anything that we've ever been held back on doing in recent years that we've not actually had part of the plan. So it's a really good relationship. It's really good fun. It's grown. We get to visit them at the races. They get to come and see the studio. Yeah. I think it's difficult to understand how completely different industries work. We work together, but we're a very different industry to the likes of something like Formula One. Yeah. So it's been great educating each other on how those things work.
And obviously, creating an annual game is always a challenge. What is the level of research that goes into doing this, and how many people are working on the game at any one time, sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, level of research is insane. Obviously, we get quite a lot from Formula One themselves. We get quite a lot from their technical guys. We've got really great access to their technical teams, so we know what they're up to. We know what's coming with the rules. We know what's happening with the cars. We also send the likes of David Greco, the handling designer, out to the pre-season tests. Yeah. Because he can get so much from just how a car looks like it's moving around, the gear changes, the acceleration. We can get a lot from that. The audio teams go out very early as well because they can get a lot from capturing the audio, but also they can understand the engine sweeps and things like that. Yeah. It's amazing how the teams use audio to analyse the car performance. So there's a lot goes into that. Yeah. And then sort of with regard to the team size, I think as we've spoken about before, we've recently increased the size of the team for the last title. Yeah. So we've got sort of a team and a third, maybe a team and a half almost now working across Formula One. So I think we sort of generally peak around 120 on one of the titles at a time, depending on art resource and QA resource coming and going. Yeah. And some of those resources are shared across both titles. But yeah, I mean, the success of the game has given us a great chance to grow. We've moved to a new studio this year, which is really beautiful. It's that sort of thing that just inspires people, and it's the success of the game that's really helped us do that. Yeah,
and obviously, I suppose one thing that most people agree you successfully do with the F1 games is you create a fun single player experience, but then also quite a fun multiplayer experience. Hence, obviously, the eSports scene taking off. What is the challenge of creating a game that balances both those things?
Yeah, it is really hard because for the likes of say 2019, we had the league system online, which, while on face value to some people might look like quite a simple system, actually it's enormous. It required a huge amount of back-end work as well. Yeah. So that was a really massive part of the game, which obviously means that there's a large chunk of the team working on that. But then we focused on another area that didn't require the same sort of resource. So you try and balance your resource effectively so that, if you've got a bunch of guys who do gameplay, you need to look at what the team who do maybe animation could be working on. So in 2019, we obviously had the cool characters with the intros, with Devon and Lucas. So that was a different discipline. So that allowed us to get really good use out of the team. So we were able to put something very cool into the single player experience, while we're also able to really push the multiplayer experience as well. And the career is where the majority of people hang out. I think as we've already mentioned, the career is it's quite unique for a racing title.
I think that's why people who may not even play many racing games will come in, because you've got a career mode and people just want to play something fun with a story sometimes.
Yeah, I think the story certainly helps, and you're generally going through what a Formula One driver goes through, but with a little bit extra. So you've got the development of the car, you've got the contracts, things like that, which are wider than a lot of racing games. I've always said it's not just an on-track experience. The on-track experience is phenomenal. It represents Formula One brilliantly. But the things that you do away from the track are kind of unique to a racing game. And I think that's why we do a sports title just as much as we do a racing title.
Yeah. And I suppose, seeing as you've played so many racing games over the years, I suppose a good question is, what is your proudest gaming achievement in terms of racing games?
In terms of what we've achieved, or I'll be really sad, but a proud one was PGR 3, was it? They did. You could qualify for a tournament, and there was an achievement that you could unlock a little gamer tile.
Yeah.
And I don't think a single one of my friends ever qualified for a proper online tournament. And I took like a day off work to qualify for that. In fact, they did a second one where you could win a trip to the Lamborghini factory, and I took 2 days off work. And I think you had to be in the top 36 or something. And I made sort of top 300. So personally, I think that's an achievement. I've still got that gamer tile as something. You can't use it anymore, but it's still there on my Xbox profile. Yeah. But for us as a team, I mean, F1 2010 was amazing. I mean, it even won a BAFTA as well, which was something that I could never have imagined being part of. Yeah. So as a team, that's incredible. In recent years, we've seen the game win quite a lot of awards, which again is amazing. And also to continue, keep seeing it grow, keep broadening the audience. Yeah. The relationship we've built with the teams, with the drivers, it's just building and building and building every year. The momentum's just building, and the fact that it is quite a strange game to work on for some people, but seeing them engage with it and want to come and work for Codemasters and work on Formula One, I think is a really big achievement. And obviously, you've been there for a decade and worked your way up to where you are now, and I imagine you want to stick around for a while and keep making them. Yeah, definitely. There's still plenty of unfinished business. There's still plenty of things that we want to do. Yeah, things that would get you slapped on the wrist if you were to tell me. Exactly. And I'd like to end the podcast with a cheesy question, quite literally, which is, if you could replace either an arm or a leg with cheese, which limb would you choose and which cheese would you choose? Ooh, do you know what? I absolutely love cheese, but I'm not big on names of cheeses. I'm generally pretty happy with just a decent cheddar, a decent mature cheddar. And I think, I'd probably go right leg at the moment, because that's the one that's aching the most, and my foot's a bit tender. So, maybe right leg, because I could certainly game with my hands still. Yeah. You could figure out a way to drive with one cheese leg and one normal leg. Yeah, no, now you've made me think, you see, because I've got a 2-pedaled auto. So, yeah, maybe the left one would be the one to get rid of, and then I'd be fine with the right ones on the brake and throttle. But then the go-karting would be difficult, wouldn't it? And we've got some go-karting coming up next month. So, and obviously, if people wanted to follow you on social media or check out anything of the games you're making, what's the best way for them to find you? Yeah, so obviously you'll see all the stuff that we do through the Codemasters channels, and we've got the official Formula One Twitter account, Instagram account, Facebook account, all the usual ones. The only one I really use pretty much the most is probably Twitter, so you can get me at the Lee Mather on Twitter. Cool. So people can normally pester me on there. But yeah, obviously, if you've enjoyed the podcast, make sure to leave a comment or just leave some love in some way. And if you've got any questions for Lee, obviously pester him on Twitter. I'm sure you might answer. I try to. So sometimes I miss some slip through the net, but yeah, I'm generally around. Yeah, I've been Brett Claxton. This has been Lee Mather. Thank you for listening and watching My First Time. Goodbye.